Hi, in this Lightboard session we're going to talk about error handling and some simple rules on how to understand error handling. So with error handling, you can build on what you know in other languages like Java. So the terminology may be different, but we are talking errors occurring in a block of code and then something happening. So with our typical flow, we may have an event source like the HTTP listener. And then you've got some lines of code, and let's say that an error occurs. Okay, so in all situations, whatever your current block of code is, so if it's a flow or if you're in a triscope, you are not going to go any further. So never goes any further. And it is then going to look and try and work out what to do next. Now, if you've defined an error handler, then it may start to look at what the conditions are, but if you have no error handling scope, then it's just going to fall back to the caller. So the caller in this case is the HTTP listener. So if you're using a flow reference, you've got to try and roll it up to what the flow reference is going to see. So if a flow reference called this flow, the flow reference will become an error. If you're talking a listener, then the listener sees an error. If you're doing a triscope, then the triscope itself becomes an error. So this notion of a caller is what it will result either success or error. Now, there are two types of error handling scope that you can have. There is an on error continue, and there is another one which is on error propagate. These are the two options. So the first one, on error continue, swallows the error. It turns whatever the error was into what appears like a success to the caller. Propagate executes the line of code or the lines of code in your scope and then essentially rethrows the error. So it's kind of like an unhandled error. Someone's got to deal with it further up. So those are the two options there. Swallow the error. In other words, the error has been dealt with, so the caller will see a success. And on error propagate says, hey, there's still an error to deal with. Now, this manifests itself in what the caller will see. So this is that result I was talking about. You've got to roll this up to what the caller sees. So in this case, the HTTP listener has two possible things that it can have happen to the flow that it's executing. It can see a happy path or an unhappy path. And it's got two different scripts that will go back to the caller. So the happy path might return a 200 OK and the payload, whereas in the unhappy path, it will return a 500 by default status code, and it will return the error.description. Okay, so that would be triggered. The unhappy path would be triggered by this. The happy path would be triggered by this. And if the flow completes successfully, it's going to go down the happy path. So that's the first rule on how to understand error handling, is that the execution will stop at that point and it never goes any further in the current block. So if this first event processor throws an error, in no situation is it going to go any further, okay, on this simple example here. All right, so those are the two types of errors or two types of situation that we can get out of error handling or a flow execution. Now, the next rule around what happens next is that you start at the first error handling block and then try and match an error type or the condition. So you can specify essentially a filter of what type of errors you want to execute, this block or this block or this block. Okay, so all of these scopes have some configuration that you can set up on them. So error type's the most common. So if you are having a communication error or there's bad data or something like that that's triggered out of this, you would have different error types coming out of this event processor. Now, these event types are determined by whoever writes the code that represents this event processor. So if it's a connector or a module, whoever built the connector or the module, they have the task of working out all the types of errors that can occur from that particular operation. Okay, so that's the first rule around there. Now, as far as when you're looking at multiple flows calling other flows, so let's say, for instance, we have a top-level flow which has a flow reference which calls something else. Okay, so you've got other essentially a nesting of calls. Now, in this case, unlike this first example, this one is the caller. So we're trying to reduce our complexity down to this sort of situation because we know how to deal with this now. So if an error occurs, then we're going to go look at these. So this flow reference is going to appear either a happy path or unhappy path. So it depends on what you do in the referenced flow. So start down at the reference flow. Don't get confused by multiple levels. Focus down where the error occurs. So if an error occurs at this point, then we know, based on our rule already, that we're never going to go any further. Okay, so we're not, whatever the line of code is immediately after it in that block, in that flow, is not going to get executed. It will then look for an error handler. Now, if it finds nothing, okay, then, and there's no global default defined for the application, it'll then bubble up, and then this one becomes an error, and then you're back to just one level of complexity to deal with, and then you can apply your rules here. Look for an error handler. Does it swallow the error? Does it continue? So that's a way to deal with these multiple call stack, if you like. Now, if we do have an error handler down here, so let's say we've got a continue. So if we've got an on error continue, then in all situations, it's never going to go to the next line of code. The on error continue, if that gets matched, then you've got to roll this up and then this becomes a success because you've swallowed the error. On error continue says swallow the error. So the flow reference becomes a tick and then it will continue on with whatever lines of code are after, or if that's the only line of code there, returns a 200 OK and a happy path if you're using HTTP here. All right, now if instead of on error continue, we have instead of the on error continue, we had propagate. We haven't dealt with the error. So propagate says rethrow it. So never goes any further, goes down to propagate. Propagate says rethrow it. So the flow reference essentially then becomes an error. And then you're down to one level of complexity again. Now there's a special rule, so one more rule. So this is how you deal with multiple levels. This is the simple case. If you don't define any error scope, so no on error continue, no on error propagate, in a place that you could have done one. So on a flow, there is a spot to put an error handler. In a try scope, there is a spot to put an error handler. So if you miss it altogether, and you define a global default error handler, which is kind of like a stand-in. So I think people can get a bit confused about what default means. Default in the case of a default error handler for your application is not one that will fall back to after it's tried to match error handlers. It's one that is put in place if there is none at all. Okay, so it's only relevant if you never define an error handler scope for the flow or for the try. All right, so it's almost like a stand-in. So if you want to think of it, the way I think of visualizing this or understanding this is at startup, if you have an empty gap and you've defined a global default error handler, copy and paste that code into that block, okay, or that empty space, and then move on. And then you're back to this level of complexity. Okay, but don't think that it's a fallback after this one doesn't match and this one doesn't match. It's only if you miss it out altogether. So, and those are the rules that I use to understand error handling. So start where the error occurs. Try and reduce your problem down to a nice simple equation. We've got to work out what the caller sees. If it's 5 levels deep, start where the error occurs. Work out, okay, I'm not going to go any further from the error point. Do I have an on-error continue or an on-error propagate? If it matches one of those, then you know whether it's going to swallow the error or whether it's going to essentially roll that up to whatever the caller is. The caller could be a flow reference, the caller could be the original event source, or it could be what does the try scope look like? Okay, because try scope rolls up into either an error or a success. And those are my rules for understanding error handling. Hope that helps you understand when you're looking at scenarios, multiple depths, how to reduce it down to something simple.